So thank you, Lee, for opening our conference with this look at how contemporary design is embracing so many different facets of arts and crafts. And we are excited to go to our next speaker now, who is Jenny Lister. She is a curator of textiles and fashion at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And she has done many exhibitions about different periods of fashion and has contributed to many books, including a new one on silk. But the reason that we have invited her to speak today is because of a project that she did on the work of May Morris, who was the daughter of William Morris. And so she's going to take us through her work, which for many of us is quite unknown. And so it's really a discovery to look at the idea of embellishment and embroidery through the eyes of May Morris. So welcome, Jenny. I see your images, thank you.
Unmute, she needs to unmute.
Sorry, I was on mute. So
hey,
thanks very much.
Welcome.
Great, you can hear me now.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the invitation to talk today, and thank you very much for that first talk, which was a great lead into what I'm going to talk about. Especially nice to be reminded of the news from nowhere and how relevant it is for us today. And it reminds me I must read this again. So this is a lovely opportunity for me to revisit a collaboration that the V&A did with the William Morris Gallery, another museum in London. And we did, I think it was the second exhibition about May Morris, someone who'd been very much in the shadow of her more famous father. And we brought together many works for the first time. So I'm just going to dive straight in. And this is a detail from one of 4 hangings in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I think you can see it's got elements of that kind of typical William Morris style. The woven silk damask was designed by him. These acanthus leaves, you can see that's very typical of William Morris's earlier work. But then May Morris, the daughter, came along and really kind of continued those ideas, but made them very much her own. But it was equally inspired by medieval art and different cultures. And she particularly made William Morris's embroidery department her own and kind of took the practice of art embroidery to another level, very much from the 1880s onwards. And, sorry, there we go. And there she is. She was very active in many fields and well known in her own right, and particularly by her 30s when these images were taken. So she was in the public realm, unlike most women of her time, of course. And I especially love these images of May at work with her embroidery frame in front of her and these side views of what she wore. And I'm fairly convinced that this is her kind of working dress. She was very active in the dress reform movement, so against tight lacing and unnatural styles of dress, but this kind of wrap over gown, which was very flattering, but it was also very practical, I think, when working at embroidery. So it seems important to just quickly illustrate her early life. And these images show the family. So William Morris is at the back there, standing behind his wife Jane and 2 daughters, Jenny and May, who was born in 1862. And they're with Edward Burne-Jones and his family, and they were great friends, and they did very much together as 2 families. So art and life was very much intermingled, and I think it was, very privileged, but equally a very unconventional background. They were surrounded by fun and activity and artistic endeavor all the time, but also this kind of sense of humor comes through so much with things like these little drawings that Edward Burne-Jones did of the family. And it was a kind of big step forward with Red House, which William Morris had built. It was designed by his friend Philip Webb, and it was a completely different kind of architecture. And the family moved there soon after they married, after William and Jane married in 1858. And I guess you can see, so it was at that time in a suburb, so quite a long way out of London itself. It kind of paid homage to early English buildings, but was also very modern too. And it was this big site for experimentation and joint projects in terms of painted furniture, painted walls, and textiles, of course, were really important. And they were kind of evoking this earlier time, which you see represented in one of William Morris's own paintings. And here you can see his painting of his wife. He was soon to give up painting. He never had the confidence, although his ultimate aim was to work as an artist. But he was soon to find out that one of his real talents was in designing. And they emulated these very early simple embroideries, such as you see on the right, this simple wool embroidered curtain with these medieval style motifs. So yeah, this extraordinary early life that May and her sister had in the midst of all this very intense and creative artistic activity. And they were quite free. You know, she was a tomboy, and they were dressed in very unconventional clothes, which were, you know, very practical. Their mother Jane had very strong ideas about these sort of things. But sadly, the older sister Jenny was diagnosed with epilepsy at the age of 15. And I think this really changed how the family operated. And from that time onwards, they were always sort of on the edge of, you know, a disaster happening. I mean, it really did affect her health very badly. So I think that's probably why the mother, Jane, she probably took a back seat in terms of artistic practice and the business side. But we know she was very much involved with embroidering for the business, but also for the home. And increasingly, the business did seem to kind of take over their lives. And May Morris always talked about this piece on the left, this lovely panel. It's actually double that size, which is an embroidery over a printed textile. So a design from the 1870s that William Morris designed, but exquisitely worked over with silk threads, with rich colors kind of overlaying the printed design. So this was, you know, one of the more expensive kind of commissions that the company, took on, but equally they were diversifying into more of these kind of smaller accessories, such as the fire screen you see on the right. And these could be bought as kits. Someone might take, you know, you might buy the panel of fabric, it would be drawn with a design, you would be supplied with the threads, and you could make this accessory at home. And you could, you know, choose the colors to an extent as well. So this was the point really where May Morris came into the business. After she had been to school, she went to college. It was called the National Art Training School, and she specialized in embroidery. And this was very much what is now the Royal College of Art, but it was very much linked with the South Kensington Museum, which has become the Victoria and Albert Museum. And by the 1880s, she was designing for the business and writing about embroidery. So really quite an active role. And we know now that she embroidered the central panel of this amazing freefold screen that you see on the right. So the shop, this is a later photograph from the early 20th century, but it was a very successful business from the 1870s with a kind of key location on Oxford Street, the central shopping street of London, and catered for many different types of people. So middle-class people might just buy a small piece in a kit to kind of keep up with this trend for artistic homes furnishings. But equally at the other end of the scale, you get amazing photographs such as this from the Ionides family, who are one of the leading clients of Morris & Co.'s business. And they literally went all out. So you've got papered ceilings, papered walls, Morris & Co. carpets throughout. And equally, they kind of fitted and blended with their collections. So you have Turkish textiles, and you have antiquities from Greece and Rome in this kind of amazing maximal effect. And of course, Morris & Co. by then was providing woven textiles as well as embroideries. And each time that William Morris took on a new skill, he would understand the materials, he would learn, he would teach himself the process of weaving so that he could design appropriately. And that was so crucial to the arts and crafts movement. And one thing that I got particularly interested in was this very ordinary looking book, which we have in the library at the V&A. And it records all the orders for embroidery between 1892 and 1894, all in May Morris's handwriting. And you really get a sense of the kind of social history and the way that business worked behind the scenes. It's an amazing survival, really. I'm sure it's down to May Morris personally that she kept it, along with masses and masses of other kind of working documents and materials, and she ensured it came to the V&A. And in a way, it really enhances our understanding of the kind of exquisite material objects and these kind of precious artifacts on display when we can look at the book and understand what these things cost and who was buying them, how long it took to make them. And one of the interesting things is that it's been about 98% of the orders are for these kits that people could take home and make for themselves. But a huge, inversely to that, most of the income was generated by these rare, special commissions that were, worked by the embroidery workroom, which included May Morris and various employees. So at one end of the scale, you might have a simple kit like this, which is a small cushion cover. It's kind of no bigger than a laptop screen. And we have this example as a kit. It's called Small Rose. And then behind it, I've just shown the tracing paper, which is reversed out, but that just shows how the design was transferred to the ground fabric with huge numbers of holes. So it's pricked through with a needle, and then charcoal dust would be brushed through and then painted to give you this bold outline that would then show you how to proceed with your embroidery at home. And then you'd also get a small area of the colors, and the technique would be shown to you so that you knew exactly what to do. And it was a really clever, simple kind of business model. Another example from our collection at the V&A, from a bigger screen, Anemone and Rose. But really, it's lovely to have these original threads from the late 19th century, and you can see these soft glowing colors that I think sometimes Morris & Co. dyed themselves. They had a factory at Merton Abbey, but also they would work with other suppliers too. But of course, this was all important. There are various myths that they only used natural dyes, and we've tested some of these, and we now know that that's not always the case. They were actually quite pragmatic about some of these ideals. And this is another amateur worked piece, but it's a design we know for sure was created by May Morris at this kind of peak moment of activity in the 1890s. So quite small and humdrum objects. And I just wanted to give a sense of place, really. So May Morris worked sometimes at home. So when she was married, she was briefly married in the 1890s, she moved to number 8 Hammersmith Terrace, this tall building in the centre you can see. So that's just by the river to the west of London. And then for a short time, she rented rooms in this, that's a modern day picture, obviously, of what was a greengrocer's shop. And then in the rooms above, she had 3 rooms where she had maybe 4 or 5 assistants who would produce the kits, kind of transferring the designs, starting them off, and then getting them ready to send out to the customers. And thanks to Linda Parry's work on William Morris from the 80s and onwards, and then also more recently, a researcher called Catherine White has done even more research into these lives of the people who worked with May Morris. And it's great to bring in some of the social history. So it wasn't only quite well-known people such as Lily Yates, who is the sister of the poet, so quite middle class, but also needed to work. But also they recruited from a local school. Some of the embroidery assistants were recruited and given apprenticeships. And what is amazing that survives in that inventory, the accounts book I showed you, is that there are little scraps of paper which tell us how long these things took. You know, each person in the studio was given a certain amount of work, and a little later on it gives us an indication of how much they were paid as well. So it becomes much more meaningful when you can understand all the work that goes into these objects. And as we've seen already, Kelmscott Manor was really important to William Morris and his family, and also I think to the brand of Morris & Co. And it was this really idyllic escape, perhaps 100 miles away from London and incredibly remote. And I have been there, and it seems very basic. I mean, the kitchen is unbelievable, and just think about how much work it would have been for the women of the family. Maybe they had help from the village, but perhaps practicality wasn't always most important, because it is just incredibly beautiful and was inspiring for Morris and his daughters. And from the age of 9, May Morris regularly went there. And it's currently closed, actually, I should say. There's a big renovation project, and it will open hopefully in the next couple of years. And there at Kelmscott House, which was built in the 17th century, and then William Morris bought it. And with the house came this rather extraordinary bed. So it didn't look like this at the time. It was just the frame. It had been made in the 1600s. But towards the end of William Morris's life, May Morris embarked on this wonderful set of curtains and the pelmet you see around the top. And he wasn't so well in the 1890s and must have spent quite a lot of time in the bed. So although it is a very personal commission, it was exhibited in the Arts and Crafts Society exhibition of, I think, 1892. And May Morris, by that point, was becoming very well known as a designer. And she was at great pains to point out that she was the source of the design, but also she worked on it with her colleagues in the embroidery workroom. And this is where we get a sense of the work that was involved and how long it took and the kind of figures. I won't go into detail about that, but there's the book, the V&A book, but there's also a book edited by Lynn Hulse, where some of this research is published. So it's a really delightful piece. It kind of blends so many of the Morris kind of key motifs, the pomegranate tree in the center, the trellis at the back. It's a bit like one of the early wallpapers that May Morris would have remembered from childhood. Also, of course, the animals around them and the birds at Kelmscott Manor are a key part of the design. And it also blends in with the earlier styles from the 18th century and earlier, the 17th century, of this crewel work style of embroidery, which used these soft wool. It's much more matte than the silk embroidery we often think about with May Morris's work, and all on this probably homespun and hand woven linen. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But obviously, that's all, part and parcel of the beauty of the piece. It's all about the materials and the understanding of how they were made, and that's so much the skill of her design as well. So this important design of the tree in the center, which was used for the Kelmscott bed, there's only one other version that we know about, which was discovered fairly recently, about, less than 10 years ago. And it came up for auction. And I have to say it was bought by an American institution. And there was a pair, and I have to say, I can't remember which institution was a successful bidder, but then there was a campaign to keep it in the UK. And in the end, the National Museums of Scotland bought the hangings. And it's because there was this very strong connection with place and the landscape in Orkney, the island in the far north of Scotland, where one of May Morris's friends lived. They had this amazing house built, his arts and crafts architect, William Letherby, and this beautiful landscape. And so May Morris recolored the hangings in kind of appropriate blues and much clearer, fresher palette to suit the light of that far northern place. So these were, a fantastic thing to find out about. So I just have some more images really to show you, and there's so much that I'm not showing you, but I think these pieces stand out. So this is a version of a tapestry design that Morris and his friend Burne-Jones produced. So it's of Pomona, so the goddess of apples, you can see in her dress. So it's very kind of timely for an autumn day like this. But it's just exquisite work. The silk floss is couched with these tram lines of thread you can hopefully just about see. So rather than the thread going in and out of the ground fabric, it's just attached very lightly to the surface. So it's incredibly glossy and shimmery, and but different technique, and worked with the Royal School of Needlework, which of course was another kind of key institution that supported the work of art embroideries. And then to me, the kind of key motif comes back again with the apple tree and all the fruit tree hangings. These are known. There are several sets, perhaps 5 or 6 that are still known, which comply with this very typical May Morris design, yet it's still repeats the motifs that William Morris was so known for. And we can just about see that May Morris has signed the piece. I think you can see just there. So we know that this was worked by her own hands, but we also know that it was worked by assistants too. And I think that's where the skill comes in as well, that these embroiderers were so skilled that their work was so consistent that you couldn't really tell the difference, that they were worked by different hands. And it took a year for the workroom to complete. The whole commission was 4 of these hangings, so 2 pairs of different designs. And despite the fact they were so exquisite and precious, and they're the most expensive thing that we found in the accounts book, they had a very practical purpose. So they were hung in a drawing room in Mrs. Monroe Longyear's house in Michigan. So it's amazing they've survived in the kind of pretty good condition that they have done. And it's great that they're accessible in Boston for people to see, although I'm sure they may not be on display at the moment. And so these kind of social networks that William Morris and his family had were very important, and they wrote so many letters, and we can read all about them. And this was an amazing junk shop find. This photograph shows Theodosia Middlemore, who was a friend of May Morris's by then, and it shows her actually working this piece here, which is in the V&A collection. She's actually stitching there. It may be a slightly fake photo kind of set up. There's no frame that you would ideally, obviously, you would need a proper embroidery frame to stitch such a piece of, it's pretty large. It's like 6 feet wide. But it was just an amazing thing to be able to find an image that shows the piece being worked. And again, to sort of hark back to William Morris, the text incorporated into these embroideries is so important. So he wrote a poem especially to go with these silk embroideries, which is all stitched in this very medieval text across the top of these hangings. And then kind of to jump to something completely different. So we know that this is a special commission. We don't know who commissioned it. It was just a little note in the back of the book which told us about a screen that was ordered, and the only request was that it had to incorporate owls, and you just get this kind of charming design with a single owl meeting another owl, and then the two become together in partnership. And it's obviously a kind of commemoration of a kind of marriage perhaps, but we're kind of conjecturing here. And then you may recognize these pieces from the cover of the V&A book. We don't know for sure that it was called the Four Seasons, but when you look closely, so it's in a private collection, and I was very lucky to go with Anna Mason, who worked or did at the time at the William Morris Gallery, and we sort of saw these beautiful pieces, and we could really go close. And so you can see that there's 4 roundels at each corner of the top of each of the 2 panels, and they focus on spring, and then you also have summer and autumn and winter. And I think by this time you can really see May is working in her prime. They're not huge, but they're incredibly spectacular. They may have been made for inside 2 panels for a glazed cabinet. And they're very restrained, and they're kind of quite stylized, but they seem to incorporate a little bit of knowledge of Japanese designs as well. They have roundels in the center with fish circling around a center, the center of the circle in the top of each panel, which seems like quite a departure. But again, going back to always William Morris and Co. materials, and the damask that is embroidered is the base fabric for the embroidery, is a William Morris design. And of course, because of all his interest in May Morris's work and these new designs coming to light, you already see that the commercial side is catching up now, and Morris and Co., which is an interiors company run by Sanderson, and they're owned by a bigger American company, and every year they bring out new textiles and kind of bedding ranges and accessories, and this time they've focused on May Morris's design for these panels, which you can buy for your home. I don't know what I think about that, but yeah, it's great that they're still so popular. So I just wanted to mention quickly before I finish that May Morris did, of course, come to America. She was quite a celebrity in her own right, not only because of her father, but also because of her own work as a socialist, and she had many connections in the States. And I think this program kind of shows something of her celebrity. And it became this sort of huge, arduous trip, you know, many long train journeys. She was followed by reporters. People were interested in her opinions, and you can see the lecture subjects that she talked about. And I think dress was something she was asked about a lot, because, you know, she didn't comply with contemporary fashion. You can see from the image on the left there. So she was a kind of active campaigner. Oh, I missed something. No, so this is the next slide. And I really wanted to focus on embroidery again towards the end of her life. She kept going back to these earlier designs from the 1870s, but using color in really new and interesting ways. So these very strong, bright colors were quite different from the 19th century embroideries that we have. So these are very striking and modern. And then by this point, she was really very busy. She was such a important person for kind of preserving her father's legacy. So this image shows her organizing the proofs for the collected works of William Morris. She was based at Kelmscott Manor in the country by then. And, you know, this must have been, you know, truly all-consuming project to publish. I think there were 25 volumes or so of her father's writing on all the different subjects that he explored. And you can see she's surrounded by amazing carpets, and this is a tapestry that still survives. It's an early tapestry from the 1600s, and that's still at Kelmscott Manor. And then we come to a very stark end, really. So she worked very hard to make sure that her father's work was properly preserved and disseminated. And there are lots of letters at the V&A showing how she campaigned with the museum management to conserve William Morris's work and to create a display. In the end, she sort of had to bargain with them. She said she'd only give these things in her collection unless they promised to create a kind of William Morris gallery. And in the end, they kind of compromised and just gave a small area at the top of the stairs, which just seems so shocking now. But she was instrumental in organizing a centenary exhibition in 1934, which was 100 years after William Morris was born. But the auction obviously happened after she died. She died in 1938, and the house had to be sold and things were dispersed. So there were no family members to come after her, which I'm sure is partly why there's so many reproductions of these designs, because there's, you know, copyright isn't an issue. And the V&A was very fortunate not only to be given things directly by May Morris, but also things that were purchased at this auction have since been given both to the V&A and other institutions as well. So we can kind of reassemble a picture of May Morris and her contribution. And I think people are appreciating her work more and more. We're obviously able to publish this book, which has been really useful. So rather than ending on this kind of melancholy note with the auction notice and, you know, this dispersal of this amazing, incredible family collection, I think it's great to be able to focus on how loved her work is now, because it was such a high caliber in its own right. It wasn't all about being in the shadow of her father. And certainly the Morris style shows absolutely no sign of going out of fashion. Certainly there's been lots of high street collaborations that we've seen in the UK here with, you know, Morris prints everywhere, all over summer dresses. And I think it's great that May Morris is being recognised. And so I guess talking today is part of that. So I'm going to end there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for opening our eyes up to May's amazing and extraordinary work. It's so beautiful.